José Francisco Garcia is a third generation and direct paternal and maternal Mexican descendants settling in the Midwest in the 20th century. A Vietnam veteran, retired railroader, and longtime Chicano activist. Jose and his wife Linda are the founders of the Mexican American Historical Society of the Midlands. Now retired, their time is spent on curating a research library of folk art, historical artifacts, and media, focused on the art and civic accomplishments of Spanish-speaking or surnamed peoples of the Americas, with a focus on the heartland. Please welcome José Garcia.
Buenos días a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. I am José Francisco Chaco Garcia Rios. My mom's name is Rios, and she gave me the nickname of Chaco when I was a little escuincle. And basically, I'm told that the word Chaco means calm. And then I started hearing that, no, it means pushed in nose for you. So I started early in my American epic reality of adjusting daily. It's been a daily challenge, and not a challenge in the way that it's educational or it's a learned, but it's the daily experience of living to be a Chicano. And I didn't become a Chicano until I was in the barracks of St. Meade, Maryland, back in 1968, when I was waiting to get mustered out of the U.S. Army, when this black athlete got up in front of the podium and went like this. And then I looked at the history books and realized that in Mexico, a year earlier, they started eliminating students that were contrary to the Mexican government to make things clean for the Olympics of 1968. That began my quest into history, and it hasn't ended. But that was kind of like the second chapter of a 78-year-old life now. In September, I'll turn 79. And you got to excuse my voice. I just got over 3 very traumatic situations. Number one, ER. At 78, maybe some of us are used to that. I picked up a bronchial issue. And it got me to where my doctor felt that there's something wrong with other things other than bronchial. And basically it was just getting old, and I was exhausted. So I still have that residue. I hope everyone can understand me, because it seems that my voice is vibrating a little bit, and it never has done that before. What was the second one? Holy cow, I got to get ready to go to D.C. tomorrow. I'm going to a convention, and then my wife is part of an advisory committee with the National Gallery of Art, because this nation is going to celebrate its 250th anniversary in 2027. So I'm also going to a convention, a GI Forum convention, and then I'm going to meet with people at the National Gallery about ideas of how to bring Nebraska, how to bring Spanish-speaking people, how to bring immigrants into the picture, and not only holding Statue of Liberty thing. She's too busy doing other things. But getting involved in the realities of how our culture is becoming so absolute diverse. Every time I walk around, there's people, oh my goodness, the next presidential candidate, his ancestry is from the Indian continent. We are a very diverse nation. So doing all of that, I'm going to go ahead and segue into the presentation of the Spanish-Mexican presence on the plains. 482 years of American history. And lo and behold, I find out I made a spelling error. You don't spell Chautauqua this way. Looks like I spelled it with an E. The French may, but not in America. I'll fix that next time. We're going to start with north of frontier of New Spain, the conquest. But I'm not starting in 1521, which this represents. Up until the Spanish they brought the Spanish measles, against which the indigenous population had no natural immunities, causing the greatest mass deaths in human history, that reduced the indigenous population above the Americas by 90%, from an estimated 64 million to about 4 million people by 1600. That population, by the way, has rebounded incredibly. There are three main players of among about 20 conquistadores that after 1521 began checking out North America for gold, oh yeah, and for more gold. And they found nothing. One of them was Alvar Núñez Cabeza, who just happened to be a Spanish conquistador that had a shipwreck, and ended up going across the southeast and becoming part of an indigenous tribe, and finding out that the New World was definitely a new world for the European experience. Another was Hernando de Soto. He was a Spanish explorer who led an expedition into the southern United States and had quite a lot of experience with the Mississippi River, and people in Arkansas called him one of their leading proponents of exploration. And then, of course, we had Conquistador Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, who led an expedition from what is now Mexico to present-day Kansas between 1540 and 1542. There are also some research that shows that he sent a squad up to the Republican River that crossed over into what is now Nebraska, and was looking for Quivera, which was the city of gold, Cibola's city of gold. That myth still was very popular when I arrived in Omaha, Nebraska in '76. Quivera was the mythology that empowered the Axarban race industry in Omaha, Nebraska. And for about 75 years, that was their monarchy in Omaha. All of the people that with money, the capitalists, all praised and worshiped Quivera as their dominion. And to this very day, they still have annual festivals that are very European in nature and very queen. This is my queen, and this is my fiefdom, and this is my entourage. So it's still living on in Omaha, Nebraska. This is the map that was New Spain back in the 1600s, or at least what New Spain wanted to conquer and wanted to explore. And it went all the way up to the Canadian. And I think that orange spot was a little Russian in there, but I haven't researched that totally. Well, we're going to start with Vázquez de Coronado when he set off to come to New Mexico and looked at the city of gold. And I had already talked about this. He was looking for gold, silver, anything that will make wealthy. He was chasing all kinds of fantasies about how the indigenous their bricks were of gold, and in fact they were made out of mud. And that they had a civilization that worshiped gold. This had a lot to do with a trail by the name of El Camino Real that started in Mexico City. And it went up to Durango, to Corralitos, Chihuahua, went straight north to Juarez, and ended up in New Mexico around the Albuquerque, Santa Fe area. And from 1540 to the end of Spain in the continent in 1821, this was the main trade route that ended up becoming part or the anchor of the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, and all of these other pioneer trails that 400 years, 300, oh, well, I'm talking about 1800, 19th century, so 300 years later, turned into the wagon train trails that began populating the innermost territories of the United States of America. And this was the wagon that began with the Mexican carretera. Carreta. This here carretera is also a misspell. It's actually a carreta. It was a two-wheel wooden vehicle of transport that the Spaniards used to move goods. And it was either pulled by men, oxen, or horses. This is what made the original wheel marks on the plains back into the 16th century. It wasn't until the Conestoga wagon and the covered wagons started coming west in the early 18th century when these bigger, huge Conestoga wagons started bringing settlers into America. The other thing that had quite an impact on the Spanish presence were the horses. Now they had been, they weren't around for 10,000 years on the North American continent. Then all of a sudden, Hernando Cortez shows up with an incredible amount of horses in 1519. Well, by 1542, there were expeditions that had literally thousands of horses in their troop. And many of these horses got stolen or went off and went wild. And within 2 centuries, they started working up North America up into the Crete area in 1750 and radically, as El Señor Vigil had said, changed the fabric of indigenous society, along with providing transport for warriors and for all kinds of actions that were being done by humans in search of a better life. The Spanish presence begins in the Great Plains. Well, I'm starting with the Villa Sur expedition of 1720. In the early 17th century, Spain claimed most of the Central Plains, including Nebraska, or what would become Nebraska. They were committed to protecting the rights to trade with Native Americans on the plains. Spain, they did the same thing in Europe. And you know what happened in Europe? It didn't work very well. Well, here in America, they lasted 300 years, but their end came pretty quick. In 1720, Don Pedro de Villasur was sent to investigate French activities in the Central Plains. This expedition took him as far north and east as the Platte River in central Nebraska, where his party was attacked and defeated by the Otos and Pawnee indigenous tribes. The Villa Sur massacre of 1720 occurred when this expedition, led by Lieutenant General Pedro de Villasur and José Naranjo, of African ancestry, by the way. The Spanish were known to have brought and made profit from slaves way back before this ever happened, 200 years before. So this was nothing new. They were attacked on the 13th of August, 1720, by the Pawnee and Otoe near the confluence of the Loup and Platte rivers. The survivors retreated back to New Mexico. The massacre was the biggest defeat for Europeans in Nebraska at the time and a major setback to the Spanish. Now, this didn't stop the Spanish. Militarily, it did, because they lost a general, they lost a priest, Mr. Naranjo, José Naranjo, who was of African descent, was one of the first to name the Platte River from a non-indigenous name. When he first saw the lower Platte, guess what he named it? Chaco. Whoa, when I found that out some years ago, I said, there's got to be a connection here. And then when he came back and found the larger Platte, which means the straightening out river, he named it El Rio Santa Maria, Jesus. He gave it another Christian name. And that name lasted for as long as the Spaniards lasted in the influence of the area, which was not very long. And then, of course, it turned into the Platte. Now, what do we know about the 1720 massacre? Well, an unknown person of great ability created the Segasur hide, which was from buffalo hides, and it's among the earliest known depiction of colonial life in the United States. The painting also included 37 French soldiers identified by their European-style clothing, conical hats, coats, breeches, cuffs, leggings, firing long arms at the Spanish military expedition. And I have whole books on this. I have about 7 books on this. And I could almost name every single character on this map. And if you notice, if somebody would turn off the lights or something, that may help in seeing a clear image. If you notice, many of the indigenous have no clothing on, which was to the Pawnee, as I understand it, a armor against whatever came to them in battle when they were protecting indigenous land. And you'll see the Spaniards, they're all around a circle protecting themselves, which was to no avail. Only 13 Spaniards out of about 67 survived. They also had over 200 Apache and Puebloan indigenous people, that the majority of them survived somehow. This is just part of the Segasur hide. There are 3 or 4 other scenes, and it's long. It's about from here to over there. And the museum in Omaha, the History Museum in Lincoln, used to have a replica that they had on display. Well, I started checking into it about 25 years ago, and I found out that the Segasur hide was up for grabs because somebody in Europe owned it. And what happened is New Mexico ended up paying $5 million for it. And it is currently, the real Segasur hide is currently on display in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, in the museum there. Or is it Santa Fe?
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. It's in Santa Fe. And I went to see it, and it brought tears to my eyes to see a document of American history with European. These French were there because they were protecting their fur trading interests with the Otoe, and also they were enemies to the Spanish. And they found out where they were at, and they attacked them. And the rest is history, which you can read in the 1993 issue of Nebraska History. Now we segue way up to 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. Spain refused to recognize the purchase. claiming everything west of the Mississippi River. Spanish activities continued, not as much with military, than with traders and forays into this vast territory until the Adamonis Treaty of 1819. There was still Spanish influence, though, in Nebraska. In 1806, Spain's resistance in the Great Plains, General Melgares was charged. This guy was part of the hierarchy, military hierarchy out of New Mexico. And he ended up bringing a little over 600 troops into the area that is now in the Red Cloud area, looking to stop Lewis and Clark and also another explorer that was in the area. Facundo Melgares led 105 Spanish soldiers, 400 New Mexican militiamen, and 100 Amerindians, and more than 2,000 animals, caballeria of horses, when he reached Nebraska, right around Red Cloud, Guide Rock, in this area by the Republican River. There is another Spanish sign in Nebraska, and I personally have always wanted somebody to give me directions to where this is at in Sheridan County. It was discovered some years ago, and it's etched into a rock in Sheridan County, and they call it the Spanish Cross. It's near White Clay, and it's the only 3 known examples of petroglyphs in the Panhandle. Early investigators believed the cross may have marked the grave or route of an early explorer in the late 1700s or early 18th. The other connection that I saw was the name Garcia was on that petroglyph. Celedonio Garcia. Right here on top. Celedonio Garcia, G-A-R and a CIA on the bottom. And one of these days, some archaeologist is going to figure out what the heck this petroglyph means. And then we come up a couple of, another decade into the 19th century with Manuel Lisa. He was born in 1772, New Orleans, which was New Spain. He was a Spanish citizen, even though he was born on the continent, who later became an American citizen, who, while living on the western frontier, which is in fact was the eastern western frontier within the Missouri River up through Montana, he became a landowner, a merchant, a fur trader, a United States Indian agent, and explorer. Manuel Lisa gained respect through his trading among Native American tribes of the upper Missouri River, regions such as the Teton Sioux, the Omaha, and the Ponca. Lisa was also involved in the supply preparation for Lewis and Clark in 1803 and 1804. Beginning in 1807, Lisa organized the annual fur gathering expeditions of the upper Missouri River region. On the first such excursion, he established a trading post at the mouth of the Bighorn River in present-day Montana. Very few of any of his forts, and there were about 4 of them. There were more, but about 4 principal forts that he established on the Missouri River that are lost to history. And this guy was an incredible individual. This tapestry that I'm showing was hanging in a Supreme Court chambers of the Nebraska unicameral at the state capitol. Now, I haven't seen this since I discovered it about 15 years ago. I don't know if it's still there, but it really blew my mind when I saw it. Manuel Lisa in a state office building in the capital of Nebraska. And I have not discovered who did it or what the situation is around that to this point. Lisa at that time became the first known United States settler of Nebraska. In 1819, Mrs. Lisa accompanied Manuel to his trading post on the Missouri side of the Nebraska side of the Missouri River, a few miles north of the present site of Omaha, which was called Fort Lisa. It's where Epley is now, and it's gone forever. Here she spent the winter of 1819 and 1820. She is believed to have been the first woman to reside in Nebraska to ascend the Missouri River, or to ascend the Missouri River. I believe she passed away about a year or two later after this. In addition to a European wife, the children of St. Louis and children in St. Louis, Lisa also had an Omaha wife and 2 children who lived at Fort Lisa. Her name was Mitan. I don't know how you pronounce this in the indigenous language. Mitan, daughter of Big Elk, highly influential, and I believe we have a relative of Bill Elk, Mr. King. During the War of 1812, Manuel Lisa was given credit for holding the Indian tribes of the West at peace with our country. He was made a sub-agent of the United States for all tribes above the mouth of the Kaw, which was a river that I grew up off of a little more than a mile away in Kansas City. We call it the Kaw River. I believe it's the same river to Kansas. And now we move up. We go through the 19th century and start going into the 20th century. Very few Mexicans lived on the Central Plains prior to 1900. According to an early study of Mexican immigration to the United States, there were only 71 Mexicans living in Kansas in 1900 and 27 in Nebraska. In 1882, we had the first significant law restricting immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. This act provided an absolute 10-year ban on Chinese laborers immigrating to the United States. This caused an incredible loss of manpower that was replaced with Irish, Polish, and other Eastern European immigrants that agents in Europe were recruiting to come to the United States to work. Well, that ran out too, because many of these people rather stayed in New York or Chicago or got their farms and had a better life than working for the railroad. In '97, the Congress imposed a 75% tax on the importation of foreign sugar, thus encouraging the development of the sugar beet industry, which was another industry that needed intensive labor, not only in the factories, but somebody had to pick weedy fields. And John Deere just wasn't around during the late 18th century, or 19th century. Other events that pushed people north, that pushed my family north for sure, was the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. Over 5 million people perished during that revolution. And it was inconsequential. It meant absolutely nothing other than take away one dictator for 7 or 8 or 9 others. All it did was erupt into confusion in Mexico, and it started causing the eradication of the Mexican male out of Mexico by many, many forces, but the most powerful ones were the United States industrial forces, railroads and agents looking for work for packing houses and for agriculture. And so they got on trains. These are Zapatistas in the south of Mexico. As you'll see, a lot of women were left by their men that got into trains and either went to war or went north, deeply affecting the male population of the country of Mexico. They became soldiers, and notice the trains, and in the background the name Pullman. These were American trains operating full tilt boogie in Mexico to bring people in to support the American industrial base, and also to help move troops around, depending on whose allegiance they were working for. And this is one of their locations where they ended up. The Great Western Sugar Company was a huge sugar beet refinery in Scotts Bluffs in 1910. The sugar beet industry employed many migrant workers, including Mexicans, Germans, and Germans from Russia. In 1920, acreage dedicated to sugar beet reached 872,000, with the Great Plains regions, which included the North Platte Valley in Wyoming and western Nebraska, producing 64% of the total crop grown in the U.S. Now, this was a product that had its roots in the slave trade of Cuba, of Haiti, of all of these Caribbean, West Indian nations, that the Spaniards brought the slavery into the picture. It wasn't the United States that started this, it was Spain, Portuguese, and then the Dutch came, and then all of these other, the English came. They had their share too. An increased need for beet laborers, with which these developments required were met by regular and methodical recruiting of Mexican agricultural workers. I never did do this work. My grandmother forbade me to ever get on a truck to go to the fields to work. No vas a hacer este trabajo, she tells me, chato. And the other two things that she said is, y nunca vas a trabajar in a hotel. Because all of my family, all my uncles and all my aunts were either workers, waitresses, bartenders, or just servers in the hotel industry of Kansas City. Because that was the only people that employed them. Because my family didn't like working in the packing houses. And there was also a lot of work in the railroads in Kansas City. If in fact the Spanish population had a lot to do with building Union Station in Kansas City back in the early 20th century. And then in the late 20s, things started happening. The solos, which were Mexican males that came alone, they were called solos, started bringing in their wives and started bringing in their families and started establishing communities in places all over Nebraska. Many Mexicans became section hands, and they would bring 10 workers to a site 30 miles outside of Omaha, as an example, west on the Union Pacific track, or north on BN track, and just set up a boxcar, give them provision, and say, this is your track, manage it, maintain it. And then they then became part of the local town, which was always nearby somewhere. And that's why you see Mexican populations all over Nebraska. I mean, even little families, little towns got 1 or 2 Mexican families been there forever. And then we went from agricultural to urban. Here we go again. They had to come somehow, and the trains were the ones that brought us up. And then we started building on our own material. Adobe houses in Scotts Bluffs, Nebraska in the 1924s. In Kansas City, my grandfather is said to have built an adobe house on the west side. I think it's a myth because I haven't found any evidence of it. But it's sworn by one of my cousins that it's true. Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens with that story. And look what happened in Omaha, Nebraska. This was immigrant. And this was made possible by the Polish and the Irish and the Germans that came to Oto country in 1860. The industrialists started a packing house industry that took advantage of the ditch that was the Missouri River, that took all of this excrement for these millions and millions of cows every month away from the packing industry, which something that you didn't find anywhere, even in Chicago or Kansas City. You found it in Omaha. And this is what happened. It just flourished, blew up, and before you know it, South Omaha became known as the Magic City because of its huge potential, its huge growth, and the way it made everyone rich. And it was because of immigrants. The factories were huge. Armour, Cudahy, Swifts, there were 2 or 3 other big, there were big 5, were all there. Huge plants. In 1955, they became the largest in the world. And that lasted for a couple of years. Now here's where the European and the Eastern and Western European immigrants had found other things to do. The generational thing, their children. There ain't no way in heck were they going to be working in the packing houses. So here comes another wave of people from the north, and they were primarily Mexican. And they began coming to Omaha, to Nebraska, to Grand Island, Wood River, to Norfolk, to Lexington, North Platte. And they became embedded in the American experience. Not in language, not in name, but in pride and civic duty and in patriotism. And I'm a good example of that. In 1935, as an example, they celebrated Cinco de Mayo at Joslin Museum. And it wasn't a solidarity to Mexico as much as it was to their civic pride of things that need to be done as a citizen. And during this time, all of their children were natural-born Americans in 1935. The man in the middle is Zaragoza, who was born in Seguin, Texas, and was the general that defeated the French in 1862. So in fact, he was also American-born. 10 years before Texas actually became a Confederate state of the United States. Not a Confederate, but they were a republic back then. I wish I knew my history. I'm not a historian. I'm a railroader by career. But I do this because this gives our Mexican-American eyes to history. They say, why don't you get a degree, Jose? Well, you know, I don't need one. I got 5 pensions. They grew up still in the packing area. They're not as much in railroad anymore. It was mostly packing houses in Omaha, Nebraska, in Cherry County, Nebraska. In this picture of the women was taken in Lexington, Nebraska. Churches were created. I'm picking this particular picture because my wife's family were the ones that established a Presbyterian church in Omaha.
Lutheran.
And her great-grandfather is to the far left. Lutheran, I'm sorry. Lutheran church. Her great-grandfather is to the far left of the photograph, with a Mexican preacher, Father Guzman, who was a cleric right there, right here. And all of these other people were very instrumental. It got married everywhere. This used to be the church on 24th Street in Omaha, right on the city strip. They didn't have a real church. They had a storefront. For over 20 years, they went to 30 years, they went to church in a storefront until they got a respectable church. The babies started coming. And then the veterans. All of these were veterans in World War II. And they were all come from families that still live in Omaha. All of these, the Vedas, the Albas, they still all live in Omaha, the Velasquezes. They started playing sports all over the Midwest. This one is a 53. They sent a team to St. Joe, Missouri to play. Because St. Joe actually had Mexican teams. And as you understand America in the 40s, 50s, it was very hard for interracial play. It just didn't happen. So people had to go and play somewhere else in league competition. The American GI Forum, a convention that I'm going to attend tomorrow, it used to be the strongest American veterans organization, almost in par with the American American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Well, sort of. We were there, and they were huge, but there were still over 150,000 people with the GI Forum. Well, it's hardly there anymore. And one of the reasons I'm going tomorrow is because I was appointed national historian about 5 years ago, and I got to make a report. Women played an incredible role. And when I came to Omaha in '76, I started understanding that the role of the male, as it was in Mexico back in the revolutionary times, was secondary, was kind of an implement that is used for power and aggression. But the women were the ones that implored, that were the enablers, that were the ones that energized whatever movement that was on. And this was very true with the American GI Forum. And it's very true today. Everywhere I go, every executive position is, and it started in Nebraska in the late 80s among Hispanic organizations. They're all run by women now. All of them. I haven't seen one male that has a large administrative position in a Hispanic organization in Nebraska. I haven't met one. I'm sure there are. I just haven't met one. And I know, Linda and I know a lot of people. The veterans, the ones that gave their lives. This is a list of veterans that gave their lives to while living in Nebraska, clear back to World War I. I haven't documented this because you just got to hire people and have time to do this. But this is part of a mural that Linda put together back about 25, 30 years ago. We still use it, we still show it. Okay, what are the top cities with the highest mestizo Hispanic population in Nebraska? La Platte, 77%. Shiloh, 71%. Lexington, 63%. Lyman, Wakefield, Octavia, and then there's Madison, which is down the street, a couple miles away. That's what caught my eye when I first came to Norfolk back about 15 years ago. South Sioux City, I can't believe that number, because they're a pretty large city now. Nickerson, Hordsville. Omaha's got 15%. That kind of expresses the city itself. In 1970, Nebraska Hispanics numbered 7,100. Can you believe that? 7,100 in 1970. In the 80s, it went up to 28,000, mostly because all of the packing houses, boom, they collapsed. They went away. They were automatized. What do you call it? Automatized, or when machines take over.
Automated.
Yeah, automated into packing houses, into automation. Yeah, there's still kill floors and all that, but not as many as before. And here again, And 1980 was also the time when it wasn't Mexican anymore. All of a sudden, you started getting Honduran, Nicaraguan, people from South America, Peruvian, Bolivian, and some Argentinos. But they went to the medical field, but that's another story. 2000, 94,000. Holy enchiladas, here comes the Spanish-speaking people. 2010, 167 people, of Spanish-American, mestizo, and African mestizo were living in Nebraska.
What is mestizo?
Yeah, mestizos.
What is that?
Mestizos is a term that means a mezcla, the mixture.
A mixture.
It's a genetic mixture. As an example, I'm a mestizo.
Yes.
In 1835, I found an entry into a baptismal list of born people in the city where my people came from, in Hidalgo, Mexico. And it listed all the people there, and each one had their descent, their racial descent. Everything was racial back in Mexico. It was called a casta system. I had people that were mulata. In other words, I had African blood in me. I don't know where it's at, but it's there. I have African blood in me. Cacique. I had indigenous blood in me. Because caciques were the ones that had the power of the earth, the indigenous power. In any city, if you had cacique in you, and then you had, there were two or three others. Mulatto. There was also a mulatto in the family, which was another African. So I'm a combination of Europe. I'm a combination of indigenous. I probably have other European blood, and maybe it's from somewhere else. I don't like DNA tests, by the way, because it throws you into a pool, and before you know it, you're related to everybody. And the negatives start coming up, you know what I'm saying? So a mestizo is the mixture, a mezcla.
Okay.
And that's what I use. I don't use Hispanic, I don't use Latino. I don't even use Mexican or for Mexico. We're in the United States, we're American.
Right.
Okay? And if you want to fly your flag, you do it in the parades and fiestas. Go have gaiety, because the Irish still do it. I mean, they do it big time. But when you're in America, you're an American. And then you go celebrate your heritage, as I'm doing right now. But I also celebrated my civicness and being here and the responsibilities of being in this country.
We may have time for one or two more questions.
Okay. And towards the end, in 2023, population of Nebraska was estimated to be 13% of the state's population. 1,980, or about 230,000 people in 2023. So it's a growing population. This presentation was brought to you by the History Explorers Club, by the Mexican American Historical Society of the Midlands, a Chicano Nights Media Project. That's my mom in the middle. Any other questions? Anybody have a question real quick? I'm out of time. We could talk later, although I'm going to have to speed out of here pretty quick. I got to catch a plane tomorrow, and I haven't even packed. Thank you very much for your time.